When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, troll. User, Daver2T. Posted, June 19, 1994.
August of 1980 was hotter than usual in Missouri, where I grew up. We lived in Columbia back then. My mom clerked at the Stuckey's Dairy Queen on I-70, and my dad was a floor manager at Woolco, so my brother David and I were alone a lot, with plenty of opportunity to get up to trouble if we wanted, but mostly we were good kids. That summer was too hot to misbehave even if we'd wanted to. If I remember right, it got up to 101 on the hottest days. Down in Texas, Hurricane Allen was coming in hard, and over in St. Louis, a man with a sawed-off shotgun had helped the murderer, Dennis Kirksey, escape a prison transport truck. But in Columbia, our biggest concern was not having air conditioning. David and I were laying on the floor in underwear when my buddy Rick pulled up. His first words after walking through the front door were, "What's up, perverts?" Rick would go through these periods where he'd repeat the same word or phrase for a while, and right now his thing was calling everyone perverts. I didn't get it then and still don't. He followed that with, "Why the hell are you two in your underoos?" "What do you think, Rick? It's a furnace out there and my old man is too cheap to get an air conditioner." "Bum deal, Ron O'Neill. Why don't we get out of here?" "Go where? I don't have money and my mom told me we can't keep mooching around the restaurant for freebies." "The icebox, baby. When the sun gets you down, you go underground. Maybe we'll find a nice troll boyfriend for Davy." Davy, still flat on his back, raised a middle finger. "Sit on it, Ricky." "You wish, Davy boy. Come on, pervs, let's get out of here." The Devil's Icebox is one of the longest caves in Missouri. It cuts through something like 8 miles of Burlington limestone, and they say its temperature never gets above 55 degrees. Rick was right. If there was somewhere to be on a hot day, it was there. The city didn't start gentrifying Rock Bridge until recently, but back in the 80s, it was the kind of place you didn't tell your parents you were visiting. Guys would go there to get high or drunk and fool around with their girl. Like I said, I was a mild kid, so I didn't do any of those things. On the rare times I'd go there, it was to check out the copperheads, alligator snappers, and newts that lived in there, away from the sun's reach. There are a few ghost stories about Columbia, most of them from the Civil War era, but only one associated with the Devil's Icebox that I know of. Supposedly, it has a malevolent spirit who inflicts accidents on people who trespass there. This wasn't something I believed back then, you understand. I was a scientifically minded kid who, at least until this story happened to me, didn't believe in ghosts or demons. But whether they were caused by spirits or not, there was a series of accidents that happened in the icebox. In 1973, a canoe carrying a group of cavers capsized in the cave stream, killing several of them. Then, a few years after my story, in 1986, David's friend Eric nearly lost his legs when a boulder rolled over top of him. He was okay in the end, but Getting him out was a real touch-and-go operation. Rick insisted we make the trip in his car, an old Buick Electra he'd bought working night shifts at the Van Dyke's warehouse. It was faded green and the seats were so frayed they were barely there, but it ran. The drive from our house on Alton to the icebox was about 20 minutes, so if I remember right, we arrived around 1:30 p.m. Inside, the icebox lived up to its name, and we all sighed in relief as the chill brought goosebumps to our overheated skin. Around 50 feet into the cave, you start to lose the natural light, and so as darkness gathered around us, I asked Rick to turn on his flashlight. "No flashlight, Coachies. This isn't that kind of operation. I brought real man's fire." With that, he whipped out his Zippo, striking it into light. To say it was inadequate would be generous, but Rick seemed completely oblivious. We began to move further into the cave, and the darker it got, the less use the little Zippo flame was. Previously, my explorations of the icebox had been restricted to visual distance of the cave's entrance, but we were now at least 2, maybe 3 miles inside. The limestone ceiling was low, and every sound from the burbling of the stream to the guttering of the lighter was magnified, like we were in a fishbowl. The overlapping noise and tiny bubble of light enveloping us gave everything an empty, dreamlike atmosphere, and when the dread began to pool in my belly, I half wondered if I wasn't about to wake up back at the house. Instead, we began to hear what sounded like distant singing. It was a trilling, cold, beautiful sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. All 3 of us froze, the Zippo light spitting and flickering at the sudden change in motion. The singing rose in volume, getting closer, and I could hear David and Rick's breaths speed up. The darkness started to give way to a hazy yellow glow, and I tried to convince myself it was the lighter, but that only lasted a moment because as my eyes adjusted, I saw the glow was coming from the cave ahead of us, spilling out from behind a bend in the passageway. Rick's mouth moved like he was trying to speak, but the only thing that came out was dry clicks. By now, the glow had completely overpowered the lighter in his hand, clearly illuminating all 3 of us, and I'll never forget the look of absolute terror on his face. When the source of the light finally emerged, we found ourselves looking at what I can only describe as a sort of tiny, luminescent wild man. It had human proportions, but couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall. The only clothing it wore was a filthy loincloth. The singing stopped as soon as it locked eyes with me, and for an instant it appeared to be as surprised to see us as we were to see it, but then its expression soured. Despite its diminutive size, the little creature began to project an immense sense of anger, like we were intruding on a private moment. David was the first to break the silence, his scream startling us from our paralysis. It seemed to throw a scare into the creature too, because when we flinched, it turned tail and ran back around the bend in the cave, its glow receding as it fled. At long last, we 3 were left alone in the darkness, panting like we'd just run a mile. "Did we just see that?" I asked. "No," Rick said, sparking his Zippo back up. "We didn't, and don't ever ask me again." It seemed to take ages for us to get back to the mouth of the icebox, way longer than it had going in, but that was almost a blessing because it gave us time to calm down. In the light of the late afternoon sun, it was hard to believe we'd seen what we had. It was all just too unlikely. Rick's sense of humor took less time to recover than my own, which I suppose shouldn't have been a surprise. As his Electra grumbled to life, he looked at David in the rear view and said, "Told you I'd find you a troll boyfriend." It was so completely out of left field that we just cracked right up, the tension flowing out of us. I leaned my head against the passenger side doors. We swung out onto the state access road and heard David pipe up from the back seat. "Sit on it, Ricky."
Subject, come and see. User, Hillbill Will 77. Posted, November 8, 1994.
In 1986, my family relocated to Danville, Kentucky, near Perryville. During the Civil War, Perryville was the site of the Battle of Chaplain Hills, a brutal battle which, even though they won, cost Confederate forces control of Kentucky for the remainder of the war. The wounded from that conflict were sent to military hospitals in Danville, and I later learned those hospitals were eventually bulldozed to build suburban houses, including the one we moved into. Strange things started happening immediately after we arrived. Muffled footsteps echoing through the attic, inexplicable cold spots, objects falling down for no apparent reason, and peculiar distortions in photographs. We're not a religious family, so we tried to rationalize what we were experiencing, but the longer we were there, the more difficult the supernatural nature became to ignore. My older sister Danielle was in college at the time, and so was given a room on the left spire of the house where she could sleep on the occasion she came home from school. Danny was my cool big sister, and I idolized her, so for at least a couple nights during her visits, I'd pack up my sleeping bag and camp out on her floor. Now that I'm a little bit older, I realize I probably made it tough for her if she had wanted to bring boys home, but I was a kid and that was the furthest thing from my mind. I just wanted to hang out with my big sis. The only problem with Danielle's room was that it sometimes got cold, and I mean bitterly cold, even on her summer break visits. I remember going in there one time to find her reading a book in bed, shivering, despite wearing 2 to 3 pairs each of sweatpants, sweatshirts, and socks, plus a pair of mittens. I planned to sleep over, but she told me not to. It was the first time she'd done that, and I was a little hurt, but I did as she said and went back to my room. For the next couple nights, Danny kept me from camping out on her floor, and I'm a little embarrassed to say my tiny heart was breaking. The final time she told me this, I started to cry, and she hugged me. After a minute, she said that she didn't want me to stay over because she'd been having bad dreams, that she'd always had bad dreams in that room, but they were getting worse, and she was starting to wonder if they were really dreams at all. She said that in the dreams, she was surrounded by the shadows of what looked like 6 men standing next to her bed. That's all she would say. They were bad enough that she started sleeping on the sofa in the den and eventually passed her room to my brother Michael. Michael didn't last as long as Danny had before the noises, the cold, and then finally the dreams chased him out. After that, the room stayed empty for a couple years. Looking back, I realized how strange that was, but no one talked about it at the time, or if they did, they kept it away from me. Last year, I was old enough for Danny to tell me more about the dream she'd had, and while she made me promise never to discuss the details with anyone else, I can say I was curious enough to ask my parents if I could move into the room. They weren't crazy about the idea at first, but I just started moving my stuff in and eventually they gave in. though they said they wanted to renovate it first. New carpet, double-paned windows that only opened a few inches at the very top, and heavy black drapes. All that took about a month, then I was finally allowed in. For the first month, it seemed like all the problems Danny and Michael had in there were a thing of the past. I put up posters, played my Bryan Adams tapes, did my homework, and when night came, I slept through. That wasn't what I wanted, though. I wanted to see if they would come for me too. And yes, they did. The cold came first, biting and awful. I was impressed Danny had made it as far as she did because it was a challenge for me to stick it out. No matter how many clothes I wore to bed or how high I pulled the blankets, I couldn't shake the chill seeping into my bones. It was in January that the shadows arrived. I awoke in what had to be the middle of the night to find them standing around me. 6 figures, just the way Danny had said, and they vanished almost as quickly as they'd come. But over the next week, each visitation lasted longer, until, on the 8th day, one spoke to me. Not loud, you understand, but I heard it in my mind, just the way Danny told me I would. It said, "Come and see." An instant later, I found myself in a burning hallway. There was smoke everywhere, and through the haze, I could make out flames. I couldn't feel the heat or smell the smoke. It was as if I was observing it all from a distance, while also being right inside it. It's difficult to explain. There were also 2 young men there, and they weren't so lucky. I watched in horror as they retched on smoke, desperately beating on the wall. They were trapped. I moved toward the small window and saw a crowd gathering on the lawn. It looked as if we were on the 3rd floor, and I could see below us people jumping out of windows and safely landing on the lawn, but we were too high up for that. None of them looked familiar to me. They were older, maybe college-aged, handsome, strong. I remained with them until the bitter end, seeing things that still haunt me to this day. After life left the very last of them, I snapped awake back in my bed, alone, and suddenly grateful for the cold. Danny had warned me that the dreams would be different every time the men arrived, that her experiences would not be mine, but that each one always ended the same way. Still, knowing what to expect and actually experiencing it are very different things. I stayed awake until my alarm went off, blasting the night's remnants away with an earful of WKLO. I spent 3 years living in the dream room, and I've lost count of how many times the shadow men came, how many times they leaned over me and said those words, "Come and see." Maybe sometime I'll tell you more.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.